I represent the Anglican Diocese of Fredericton. I'm just so pleased to be able to partner with the Faculty of Education at UFB, mostly because Alan and I have been friends for many, many years. And so we're just thrilled that we can have the opportunity to have a forum like this, and hopefully many more in the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nancy. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Faculty of Education Colloquium Series. My name is Matt Rogers, and I'm an assistant professor here at the Faculty of Education, and I'm the research coordinator for the faculty. We'd like to begin tonight by recognizing and respectfully acknowledging that our discussions are located on the unsurrendered and unceded traditional lands of the Wolastoqey peoples. It is my pleasure to introduce you all to Dr. Alan Sears, professors of social studies education here in our faculty. Dr. Sears has been a social studies teacher for more than 30 years and has taught at all levels from primary to graduate school. He teaches undergraduate courses in social studies methods and international education, and at the graduate level he teaches courses in research methods and educational policy. Tonight, Dr. Sears will be presenting a lecture entitled Having Faith in Citizenship, the Place of Religion in Canadian Public Square. Dr. Sears will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. And please note that this event is being live streamed for members of our faculty and our community who wanted to attend but couldn't be here for whatever reason. And after the talk, please consider joining us down the hall to the left for a reception. Usually lasts for about 45 minutes to an hour after the event. So if you could all please help me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Alan Sears.
Thank you, Nancy and Matt. Since Matt has done the territorial acknowledgement, I won't repeat that except to acknowledge it's important. I also thought tonight that given the topic, I might acknowledge that we are meeting in a university founded by the Anglican Church. 200 meters from a university founded by the Roman Catholic Church. Sometimes my students are very surprised to find out that people who are religious have anything to do with the life of the mind. And given some of the people that are religious that engage in the public square, it's little wonder that they wonder. But anyway, I do want to acknowledge those two institutions performing these universities as well. It's I'm happy to be here. I was asked by the diocese to do this. I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself to start. I don't usually do this. My critical theory colleagues always kind of position themselves, and I just launch right in. But I thought tonight it may be important to say why I'm here. When St. Paul showed up in Athens, this is the question that the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers asked about him as they saw him engage in the agora, or the marketplace. What does this babbler have to say? I'm here tonight on a very personal project. My life, the first reason I'm here is my life has been falling apart of late. My professional life. Matt, there were two things wrong with Matt's introduction. First, I'm going to talk longer than 30 minutes. I'm sorry. Second is I've been a social studies teacher for more than 40 years, and not 30 years. And the center of social studies teaching is civics or citizenship education. That has nothing to do with getting ready to take the citizenship test. You can be a good citizen in our world without even being a legal citizen. Citizens are people who engage intelligently, thoughtfully, and productively in our common life. So that's been my job for 40 years, to get people ready to do that. My colleagues in literacy and numeracy education are always being called on the carpet because we have all these international and provincial tests, and they get projected in the paper, the results, and we always find a way to project them in negative terms, although the results often aren't so bad. But we do find a way. But I've been free of that. But I want to read you an assessment of my work, and I want you to guess where this came from. Here's an assessment, a recent assessment of my work that was very public. I've never been so worried, so stressed out, and so shocked. Most unnerving has been the division of the country and the hatred that comes out of groups of people who can't discuss anything, can't understand each other, can't talk. It's like they don't even speak the same language. What country do you think they're describing? When I tried this today earlier, there people said the United States, and it could be the United States, but it's not. It's a French political scientist, Nicole Baccarin, speaking about the presidential election in France in 2016. In Poland, in Hungary, in the United States. If you were living today in Brazil, In many places in the world, this kind of rhetoric, and I think increasingly so in Canada, is taking place. So there's an assessment on how well I've done, and I've worked around the world in civic education, in Canada, in the United States, in Australia, in England, in Hong Kong. I've worked around the world, in Russia. That's really been a success. And so it's not working out so well. And I have to say that I've had something of a crisis of confidence in the question of whether it can work. And the other thing that bothers me as a person of faith, because I'm here tonight as a practicing Christian, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, is that people from my own religious tradition are sometimes the greatest purveyors of this kind of talk. Shame on us when that's true. I'm a practicing Christian. I thought that was important to know. So I am talking about religion in the public square, not Christianity alone, but I do come from a Christian background. And when I say I'm a practicing Christian, I mean that in two ways. First, the usual way we use the phrase is I engage in the rituals and traditions of Christianity through the Anglican Communion. So I attend church and participate in the rituals regularly. I'm also practicing in the sense that I'd like to be a Christian and I'm not very good at it. And so I'm practicing to get better. So if you look at that. That's one of the reasons why I'm here. There's another reason why I'm here. In 2009, a committee at Harvard University did a review of the core undergraduate program that every undergraduate has to take as part of their bachelor's degree at Harvard University. And they came back with a report that said, in part, that given the nature of the contemporary world, it was important for an educated person to know something about religion and religious life and religious people in order to be in the world. And so they recommended that part of the core curriculum at Harvard be religious studies. John Bach, my colleague here from Renaissance College, wanted to be worldview studies, but they had the same intent in mind, I think. And Steven Pinker, who is probably the most famous professor of psychology at Harvard University, wrote a screed about this report in the Harvard Crimson that said this in part: universities are about reason, pure and simple. Faith, believing something without good reason to do so, has no place in anything but a religious institution. Bit ironic when you consider who founded Harvard. The Puritans as a theological school. But and I profoundly disagree with Dr. Pinker on a whole bunch of levels. I disagree with him that faith is about believing things without good reasons to do so. I also disagree with him that university is no place for discussions about religion. I would have agreed wholeheartedly with the committee at Harvard. And so when I talked with Nancy about the diocese wanting to do something more in the community, I said one part of the community that people of faith don't seem to engage with particularly well sometimes is the university. And so perhaps we should do this. And to be honest, I suggested a number of things we might do other than me giving a talk. Nancy can testify to the truth of that, but here I am, and here you are. The other thing I want to say, the reason I'm here, is that Sir Bernard Crick, who is one of Britain's, was a late Bernard Crick, was one of Britain's most eminent political scientists, and the father of what is today the national curriculum in civics and citizenship in English and Welsh schools that was implemented as part of the national curriculum in 2001, once said this: citizenship is secular on historical and philosophical grounds. And I had the privilege of working with and meeting Dr. Crick on some of my work in England. I respect him immensely. He's a scholar of George Orwell, has written a very well-respected biography of George Orwell, as well as editing the most important collection of Orwell's essays. But I disagree profoundly with him as well. And I think it's interesting because he traces citizenship, in democratic citizenship, to the ancient Athenians, and they would have not known the concept of a world without religious life. Right? And so I think he's profoundly wrong about this. So I'm here to kind of raise some questions about that. So just let's talk a little bit about where religion showed up lately in Canadian public life. Here's one example from a recent one from the Canadian Summer Jobs Program and the Liberals' requirement that we all sign on to great liberal philosophy and check the box that says we won't disagree with anything that, I know, being a little sarcastic now, but which caused consternation with a number of faith groups across Canada. This one was particularly jarring to me in the community of Outremont in Montreal. some concerns by neighbors about the school buses that were going to private Jewish schools in the neighborhood. And to protest these school buses, that people wore yellow badges to a meeting. They said, because the school buses are yellow, it is hard for me to imagine that intelligent people, educated people in Canada wouldn't also recognize the other implication of that act. But let's not dwell on all problems, right? So in the recent Syrian refugee crisis, this story appeared in the Globe and Mail. It was Christian groups that invented private sponsorship of refugees in Canada, beginning with the refugees that poured out of Chile in the 1970s after the American-inspired coup, the toppling of the Allende government, and then formalized some of the legal structures that we now use in the 1980s in response to the rush out of Vietnam by the so-called boat people. And religious groups have continued to take the lead in private sponsorships of refugees in Canada. This is interesting. You know, one of the things I hear whenever I talk about religion and public life is, well, we have separation of church and state. Well, but we don't. So let me say two things about that. First of all, this isn't a concept we have in the law in Canada, because in Canada we have 3 provinces, for example, with publicly funded Roman Catholic schools. That is pretty tantamount to not having separation of church and state. Almost every province in the country, west of here, provides some funding to private religious schools. Just as some examples of the areas where we don't have separation of church. So that's one thing I'd say about separation of church and state. The second thing I would say about separation of church and state, it was invented by Christians to protect religious groups from the state, not the state from religious groups. It was actually invented by a guy named Roger Williams, who formed the state of Rhode Island. And there's a great new book out by Teresa Bejan about called Mere Civility, about Roger Williams and the idea of the separation of church and state. Thomas Jefferson borrowed his phrase. It's not in the Constitution of the United States, the phrase, although it is more of a legal concept in the United States. But even there, I think it's largely misunderstood. But it was formed by religious groups to protect them from persecution by the state. Now we tend to use it as to protect the state from these horribly oppressive religious groups. I will say this to my religious friends in the audience. We've earned some of it. It's no accident, for example, that France is the most secular state in Europe and was the one that invented the regulations about wearing of religious symbols in public places, because of the connection between an oppressive state and the Roman Catholic Church. So we have sometimes earned the animosity of people. When I was in Quebec City a couple of years ago, there was a woman dancing on one of the streets in an outfit and carrying a sign that says, "There is no God," and Muhammad and Buddha, and she was running. And you'll hear this in the conversations in Quebec that I'll talk about a little bit later, about the restriction of religious expression in public life. We were oppressed by the Catholic Church once. We are not going back there. And they see some of the modes of religious dress that they're trying to restrict as symbolic of that oppression. And they have they're not wrong to see it that way, right? So I am not here tonight at all as a real poser, as someone who thinks we need to make Canada great again by taking her back to some quasi-Christian consensus of the 1950s. So we can talk way more about that if you want to. It's not only in contemporary life where religion's been important in public life, and as I said, it's not only important because of problems, it's also important because of good things. These two men, McAvoy and Woodward, are journalists for The Economist, and wrote a book several years ago called God is Back. And they make, and among other points they make, is this point, that both the anti-slavery movement in Britain and in Britain's pushing of that movement out into the world, and the civil rights movement in the United States was gripping with participation by religiously motivated people. In the interest of full disclosure, my own denomination was involved in running Indian residential schools in this country, to our shame. We have apologized, and have worked towards finding compensation for the people who went to the schools that we participated in running. We have recognized that they were wrong. We're moving towards reconciliation on that front. But that's another aspect that the United Church of Canada, the Roman Catholic Church, and others were involved in implementing public policy through the Indian residential schools. My daughter works for the Mennonite Central Committee in Ottawa, which is a religiously based organization very interested in engagement in the civic square. And before that, she worked for a group called Citizens for Public Justice, which come from the Christian Reformed tradition in Western Canada. Joe Gunn, the author of this book, is the director of that organization. And these are just some of the chapter headings of ways, again, when people of faith have engaged in what might be considered more progressive ways in Canadian public life. This is a book that actually describes the development of refugee law and the influence of religious people in Canada in the development of religion. And of course, the most recent iteration of concern about religion in public life is the promise by the new government, the government-elect in Quebec, to pass legislation restricting the wearing of religious symbols by members of the public service. I find it ironic that this is about 30 years after the federal government moved to allow Sikhs to serve in the RCMP with their turbans and Indigenous men to serve with their braids, recognizing the fact that you can't police or serve a community properly without members of that community involved with the organization that's policing them, and it won't be effective to ask them to police in that context when you ask them to deny fundamentally who they are as members of that community. This seems to me ironic that this is happening, and it's also ironic that it happened on the very same week that there was a court decision in Quebec that said the opposite. This woman, Reina El Alul, lost her car and was impounded because her son was driving without insurance. When she went to get it back, the judge refused to hear her case because she showed up wearing her hijab. And she went to court. And this is a portion of the ruling, the Quebec, it was a judge of the Quebec Superior Court. The Court of Appeal unanimously overturned that ruling and said in part this in their judgment. It follows that litigants are permitted to express their sincerely held religious beliefs, including with respect to religious clothing, and the courts must accommodate the exercise of that right in a courtroom insofar as it does not conflict with or harm an overriding public interest. Freedom of religious expression does not stop at the door of a courtroom. The court is making my case for me tonight. That's the way. Freedom of religion is a two-sided right. In its more passive form, it's the right to believe anything you like. But in more active form, it is also the right to express that belief, to live it out. And freedom of religion is really not all that effective if it's only the first and doesn't include the second. So why am I here? I'm here to make these arguments. We live in a secular age that largely sees religion as anachronistic or a problem. In other words, it's old-fashioned. Get over it. Secularism sees itself as neutral and the natural end of human development. Secularism is not neutral, but a creed or a sect in its own right. And a truly pluralist society is officially non-sectarian. I suggest that when we talk about a secular society, we maybe should talk about a non-sectarian society. Not that I believe there is a neutral place to be. One of the arguments you'll often hear in this debate is, I don't want those religious people imposing their values on me. Well, folks, every time we make a law, we impose somebody's values on everybody. We don't live in a value-free or a neutral society. It's not a question of will we impose values, it's a question of which and whose values will we impose, or will we agree to live by. I like better than impose, right? So every time we make a law, every time we develop a constitution, in our constitution, for example, we have the equality rights. That is a moral expression. What is a proper relationship between and among people of different genders, of different sexualities, of different races, of different religious creeds? We've made a moral statement about that, and And so we can't get to a place that's neutral. Religion and religious expression are not problems for democratic societies to solve or to get past, but important and complex elements of civic context, and citizens need to understand that in order to participate justly and effectively. I'm not going anywhere. My religious friends aren't going anywhere. And so we need to learn to live together with this complexity. I think we always want things to be simple. And as we're learning in many countries in the world, a simplistic approach to citizenship is perhaps not the best one. So I want to go for nuance that we can learn to live together. Finally, I'm playing with two concepts in my own work in civic education, civic empathy and civic vulnerability, which I want to suggest to you are ways forward. I could talk about any of these topics at length, believe me, ask my colleagues, a lot of my students are here, they'll tell you that's definitely true. I'm going to try to kind of breeze through them tonight. But we do live in a secular age. Early in the 20th century, Max Weber, the originator of modern sociology, called for the disenchantment of the world. I've written about this in a book that I co-authored with some folks, and I think you can use it. He meant enchantment in the idea that you've been spooked and deceived, and we need to get rid of this deception, kind of like Marx meant by religion being the opiate of the masses. But we can also use enchanting in a very positive way, right? That something is enchanting, it's attractive, it's kind of transcendent, and we want to be associated with it. It's beautiful. I'm all for an enchanted world in the second sense of the word. But Weber's arguments led to what is widely known in sociology as the secularization thesis. We'll outgrow this. We'll get beyond it. As we get educated, as we imbibe the liberal order, we'll leave religion behind. That's what caused McIlwaite and Woodbridge to write their book, because they were kind of surprised that God was back or had never gone away. And figuring, how are we going to deal with this? This should have gone. Our most famous philosopher, I think, Canadian philosopher, is Charles Taylor, and he has written a big, thick tome called A Secular Age. I'd like to tell you I've read it cover to cover, but I'd be lying to you if I did. But he also chaired the Bouchard-Taylor Commission on reasonable accommodation in Quebec a number of years ago, and wrote this about democratic societies, or seculars, what he called a secular society, imbibes the moral equality of persons, freedom of conscience and religion, the separation of church and state neutrality in respect of religion and deep-seated secular conviction. I don't know how Mr. Bouchard feels about moves by the Quebec government to restrict religious dress, for example, but Charles Taylor's been quite adamant that he doesn't support that. So religion is an anachronism. I'm going to give you a couple examples. One example is Francis Collins. Shortly after Barack Obama was elected president, he nominated Francis Collins to be head of the National Institutes of Health. The National Institutes of Health is the biggest medical granting agency in the world. It funds most medical research in the United States. And if you're walking and talking today, it's probably at least partly because the National Institutes of Health does its work and gives medical researchers stuff to do. He's also a Christian who wrote, among other things, a book called The Language of God, which is shown on the screen. Sam Harris, one of the so-called new atheists, writing in the New York Times, was forced to acknowledge that Francis Collins was eminently qualified. He was a world top scientist. He headed the Human Genome Project. In other words, he was the lead scientist in the worldwide quest to map the human genome. It would be hard to think of anybody more qualified than Francis Collins to head up the National Institutes of Health, but Sam Harris didn't think he was qualified because he believes in the transcendent. He doesn't believe everything can be explained by our biology and physiology. Steven Pinker and other people like him are evolutionary psychologists. So our altruism, our love, our religious faith, those ethereal things that many of us feel important in our lives, they would say have evolved as part of our biology and physiology as ways to make us better reproducers. in the evolutionary circle. I might say to Richard Dawkins, if it's true that religion has made us more efficient reproducers and guaranteed our survival on the planet, perhaps we shouldn't mess with it. Just saying. So Sam Harris thought because of this he wasn't qualified. But a more recent example was our own Governor General, who very shortly after she was made Governor General gave a speech at a conference of engineers and scientists at which she said this. I'll let you read it for yourselves. It is offensive to me on many levels. I think in the case of understanding religious people that Julie Payette demonstrates a vast ignorance. She conflates religious people of a whole bunch of traditions. First of all, if you believe that there was some sort of divine intervention in creation, she associates you with people who would deny climate change, for example, and human participation in climate change, and she implies that all people who would acknowledge a divine role in creation are young Earth, six-day literal creationists. That's the impression I get from this, which is not at all true. Many people from different religious traditions see the divine in nature and see a role of the divine in creation, who I think aren't the ignoramuses that Julie Payette claims that they are. But I think this is just kind of indicative of where we are. Now, one of the things I noticed about anachronism, though, is it's pretty selective. When Martin Luther King Jr. shows up, or Desmond Tutu, or the Dalai Lama, or somebody who we would regard as progressive, we like their religious infusions in the state. My theory is that what we don't like are conservative intrusions into public life, conservative religious intrusions. We don't mind liberal and progressive ones. It's really interesting when Adrian Clarkson introduced Desmond Tutu at the University of Toronto when he got his honorary doctorate, she never mentioned that he was a bishop in the Anglican Church. And I would argue that Desmond Tutu's work for peace and reconciliation and justice in South Africa was supremely motivated by his faith position. So we do kind of like that. And even when it's more conservative groups, this showed up in the newspaper. The King's University in Edmonton began working with Omar Khadr when he was members of the faculty there, who I know began working with Omar Khadr when he was still a prisoner in Guantanamo Bay. And they went down there, met with him. They prepared him for his GED to take his high school equivalency while he was still in jail there. And then several of them were character witnesses for him when he was both being tried in Guantanamo Bay and when the Canadian government was considering transferring his sentence back to Canadian jail. When he got back to Canada, the Kings immediately enrolled him, and he got a degree there. It's a great example of a religious community, I think, contributing positively across religious and ideological lines to public life in Canada. My next argument, secularity is neutral. This is the basis for the impetus in Quebec over several governments to restrict the religious expression, particularly in terms of wearing clothing in public life. The first iteration was a law proposed by the Parti Québécois before they were defeated in an election. Some think for proposing this very law a few years ago. And the law itself said the purpose of this bill is to establish a charter affirming the values of state secularism and religious neutrality. My argument is that secularity isn't neutral, that it is a creed. It answers ultimate questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? What is our purpose on the earth? What is the appropriate relationship between and among peoples of different kinds and different ages and different genders, between humans and the non-human world? All of those kinds of things Lois Sweet was the religion and ethics reporter for the Toronto Star in the 1990s. She took a leave from her job to go and study the rise of private religious schooling in Canada, which she was convinced was creating hotbeds of xenophobia and hate. Religious people were squirreling their children away in places where they could indoctrinate them in their own beliefs and against the beliefs of everyone else. she went in there, she says in this book that she wrote about her experience with that attitude. At the end of the year, she had changed her mind completely. That doesn't happen very often. But what she found, she did find places that were nests of xenophobia and hate. She did find them. But overall, that's not what she found. She found religious parents who had opted for religious schooling not really by choice. They had opted for religious schooling because the schools gave no quarter to religion. Religion was on the margins. It wasn't attacked. It just was never mentioned. It never showed up. And for them, this vital and important area of life was missing, and they wanted it there. So what she found was Jewish and Muslim parents sending their kids to Catholic schools. Not because they wanted them to be Catholic or Christian, but because they wanted them to go to a place where it was acknowledged that faith wasn't crazy, wasn't marginal, could be central to one's life. But the impetus of this is secularity is neutral. The schools have to be neutral. There are many places in the world that do religious education really well without indoctrinating people. In North America, we are abysmal at it. Could come and talk about that, or better yet, get John Long to come and talk about it. One of the most interesting experiences in my life recently about secularity as neutral is I was the external examiner on a PhD thesis at the University of Toronto, and Angela MacDonald, who wrote the thesis, went to Alberta and interviewed science and social studies teachers about their teaching of controversial issues. Did they teach controversial issues? What issues did they teach? How did they teach them, et cetera, et cetera? One of the things she asked them was, how did their own kind of ideological faith position impact their teaching? And the interesting thing is, this is confirmed in my work. I do research on how people understand ethnic diversity in schools, teachers and students. We hear this all the time. When we ask people to write an essay describing their own ethnicity, most white middle-class Canadians say, I don't have one. I come from the neutral place. That's what her teachers told her. And in fact, when she asked them if they had a religious position, they said no, and thank God. Because those people who are religious can't teach controversial issues fairly in a balanced way. I thought it was quite ironic that I was reading this thesis as a person of faith, and it wasn't Angela making these claims, but her teachers made them over and over again. It was a universal thing, right? Here's a quote from her thesis. They could be neutral, but I couldn't, or a Muslim couldn't, or a Jew couldn't, or a Sikh couldn't, because we're just so blinded by our ideology. Not only were they neutral, but they assumed by what they said was, we're all coming to that place. That's the place to which we move. So secularity isn't only neutral, it's natural. In my own work interviewing teachers about how they understand ethnic diversity, one teacher said it really well. She was talking about her own ethnicity. She said, all that stuff was all important to my father, but we all get over that. So it's back to the secularization thesis. With education, with urbanity, comes the demise of religion. And that was, I think these teachers that she interviewed are not at all strange. I think it's ubiquitous in the culture. It's not just to teachers. That secularity is neutral, and it's the natural position to which we ought to move. Marilynne Robinson, the Pulitzer Prize-winning American novelist and iconoclast, put it this way. If the West has an enduring faith in any one idea, is it that the West advances. That is to say that it matures in the direction of enlightenment, with all this entails in terms of the loss of illusion and the rejection of error. I would recommend Marilynne. I do. She's got a new book of essays out, Why We Were Here, that's just brilliant, but she's pretty dense, and I think I only understand about a third of most of the essays, but I love them all. She's very good. But secularity is a faith. It's not. It is a position. In France, at the Revolution, they were justifiably angry about the Catholic Church's complicity in the oppression of the French people. And so when the revolutionaries got control, they declericized France. They took over the church lands, they took over the appointing bishops, They worked to make France a secular state. That's why you see France today with La Cité as their policy position on this kind of neutral public square, secular public square. But they built a temple called the Pantheon, the House of the Gods. And they put in it the saints of secularity. Rousseau, Voltaire, Zola, on and on and on. I'm not arguing against the works of these people or the ideas of these people. I'm just saying that they come from a position. And their position, I would argue, is pretty indistinguishable from a religious position. Right? John would want me to call it a worldview, and that's what it is. Not only is secularity a faith position, it can descend into a fundamentalist faith position, like this. Now, the first quote here is from Os Guinness, who's a Christian philosopher. So you might understand why he gets a little prickly about secular fundamentalism. The second quote is from Terry Eagleton, who is a British literary critic, a very famous British literary critic, who is anything but a Christian philosopher. If you want to read an atheist on faith, I recommend Eagleton. Way better than Hawkins. Dick. In his book, Eagleton conflates Richard Dawkins and Michael Hitchens, the Ditchens. Doesn't think much of them. This, in fact, he's describing Christopher Hitchens right here. But this is what Eagleton says about religion in the introduction to his book, which is called Religion, Faith, and Revolution, Reflections on the God Debate. Religion has wrought untold misery in human affairs. For the most part, it's been a squalid tale of bigotry, superstition, wistful thinking, and oppressive ideology. So this isn't a guy that's sympathetic necessarily to the religious position, but he gets Christianity better than almost every Christian I know, if you read his book. And his argument with the new atheists, so-called, is that they attack the caricature of faith. Not only Christianity, when they attack faith, they attack faith's caricatures and diminish the contributions faith might make to public life. My argument is that we do not live in a secular world. We live in a pluralist world where everyone comes to the table with a particular ideology or worldview position. That's the position of Peter Berger, who wrote this book really to counter the argument of Charles Taylor that we do live in a secular age. I read, Peter Berger must be an old guy, because I read I had his book in my first year sociology class at UNB in the 1970s, but he's still writing. So as Nicholas Waite and Woolworth point out, religion persists. We're here. So we have to learn to live together, I think, in a civic life. And ironically, as I point out in this quote, not only is religion here, but democracy has in some ways made it stronger. When people choose their faith, when it's not imposed on them by a state religion, they tend to adhere to it more vigorously. So democracy has actually increased people's. Christian Smith, the sociologist at Notre Dame, has a new book out trying to understand religion and how religion works in the world. And he says this, that we have to deal with it. We have to understand it. We have to know it. And I think that works for people at all sides of this equation. That we have to know each other and stop believing the stereotypes, the superficial things on all sides of this debate. Teresa Bejan, in her book called Mere Civility, largely deals with, makes an argument for recovering Roger Williams, the Puritan divine who was kicked out of Massachusetts for his contrarian views and went and established the state of Rhode Island and established the idea of the separation of church and state. And Williams was really innovative in his not only allowing for a range of Christian expressions for different Christian denominations, but for recognizing the freedom of religion for non-Christian groups, including indigenous Americans. And so Rhode Island became this beacon of religious freedom. And she argues that when we deny people the ability to live out their fundamental beliefs in public life, we are in fact acting unjustly. Richard John Neuhaus, who's a Roman Catholic writer, says it a little more crudely, but I kind of like this quote a little more maybe. In a democracy that is free and robust, an opinion is no more disqualified for being religious than for being atheistic or psychoanalytic or Marxist or just plain dumb. Religion in public is but the public opinions of those citizens who are religious. And so I would say that a Muslim shouldn't have to hang their coat or their hijab on the door when the Marxists can come in with their ideology to the public square. I think exclusion doesn't work for a number of reasons, but here's three. First of all, as Bejan and Neuhaus said, it's just simply unjust. I don't see any reason for it. It's unjust to religious citizens. The second reason, it kind of infantilizes non-religious people by assuming non-religious people are all going to be duped and somehow overwhelmed by religious people's participation. They're going to be, in the words of Max Weber, enchanted in that negative sense of the word. And I don't think that that's true, right? Most people can make an argument, can listen to an argument, or they should be, right? The third reason I think it is that it squelches alternatives, which is dangerous for democracy. If you haven't read John Vanier's book, Becoming Human, John Vanier is a Canadian who founded the large communities around the world and gave the Massey lectures, I believe, in 2006, which are reproduced in the book, Becoming Human. You should read it. It is profound. Vanier argues that there are two things that most humans need. One is a sense of self-fulfillment. We need to be ourselves, to achieve for ourselves, to be recognized for ourselves, to be valued for ourselves. And we need, the second thing, to belong. Those are both fundamental human needs, and they're both in that sense good, but they both have a toxic side. The toxic side of our individuality and our need to succeed and our need to be recognized and our need to be fulfilled is hubris and self-centeredness, and we see how that works itself out. And the toxic side of community is when community squelches our need to be an individual, when it becomes oppressive. And he says, so we need to find the sweet spot and tension between and among these. And one of the ways to do that, he says, was with dissidents. Our communities all need dissidents, those people who ask questions. I would say that about religious communities and our public square. We need people who pose alternatives, who ask questions, who enliven the debate, who can make us question even our fundamental beliefs and think them through again. And in particular, think through how we live those out. Recently, there was an example of this in a small way in the Washington Post, in an article by Rabbi Dania Rutenberg, just before Yom Kippur, which was just a couple of weeks ago, the Day of Atonement in the Jewish tradition. And she was writing as a rabbi in response to some of the men, and most notably Louis C.K. and Jiam Ghomeshi, who had been outed by the Me Too movement and had attempted a comeback of sorts, had attempted to reinsert themselves into the public square. Louis C.K. by performing at a club in New York City, and Jiam Ghomeshi by writing in the New Yorker. And she reflected in her essay about what Jews have learned over centuries of reflecting on what it means to make atonement and to receive restoration. And it's a hard thing. And she said, what can we learn from this about what that means in our common life, in our public life? Because folks, we have to find a way to think this issue through. It's a big issue and it's an important issue. It goes to fundamental questions of justice and relationship. And she was trying to help us think this through, bring to bear on that some insights from a centuries-old religious tradition. I can send you the link to the article if you like. I thought she did a great job. That's just one example of the way in which a religious community might contribute positively to the civic space. So I'll close by talking about these two concepts I mentioned before. The first is civic empathy. And civic empathy is, for me, a double empathy. We usually understand empathy. Empathy is trying to get inside the head of another person, trying to trying to understand their world and their worldview. And I think we need that in the civic square. But civic empathy goes beyond that. And I draw from two people I've read and listened to recently. One is Catherine Hayhoe, who is a climate scientist and head of a climate science institute at Texas Tech University, a Canadian, who is also a self-identified evangelical Christian. And this is what Hayhoe says. Michael Enright is interviewing in the Sunday edition, and he said, you know, a lot of the opposition to climate change science and research comes from religious communities, and particularly evangelical Christian religious communities. And he says, what do you do with this? How do you talk to these people? And her answer is basically, well, first I talk to them as people. Before I start preaching science to them, I look for a connection. And I try to help them understand that they have a connection with me. A more academic way to take this is with Jason Stanley, who's a professor of philosophy at Princeton, who wrote a book called How Propaganda Works. And he developed this idea in that book called Civic Rhetoric. He uses W.E.B. Du Bois as a key example, the African-American civil rights activist of the late 19th and early 20th century. And he said what Du Bois was great at was helping his opponents understand who he was. So his empathy was not only in understanding those with whom he was arguing, but civic empathy or civic rhetoric for him was helping them understand him and where they might have connections with him. And so I'm beginning to wonder in education, can we teach people this kind of empathy? Can we teach people, A, to begin to understand others? Jamie Rowinski over here is trying to work that through in terms of history and historical perspective. Can we teach people about the past and to be inside a time in the past, which is like being inside the head of another person? And can we teach them to speak in ways that might help others understand them? I don't know. I've chosen to believe that we can, because if I don't believe it, I go to a dark place. Finally, the idea of civic vulnerability. Oftentimes we find ourselves in a position of what I would call contextual vulnerability. Our context makes us vulnerable. What the At Me Too movement has shown us, if we didn't already know it, is that the patriarchy has forced women into a position of vulnerability for years. Not by choice. They didn't choose to be vulnerable. They didn't want to be vulnerable. They are vulnerable by the way the world works. Indigenous communities in Canada have been vulnerable. Colonialism has made them, has created a position of contextual vulnerability. Civic vulnerability is a little bit different than that. It can flow from contextual vulnerability, but civic vulnerability is intentionally giving up power for the sake of the common good. And Mahatma Gandhi, for example, and Martin Luther King were both contextually vulnerable. They both were men of color who lived in oppressive colonial states. And they actually chose, rather than to use violence, to use vulnerability to make their point. They divested themselves of even more power, put themselves at the mercy of attack dogs and people with guns and sticks in jails in order to make their point. Recently, I've written about another small example, I think, of civic vulnerability that John McCain was extolled for when he was running for president against Barack Obama. And in two cases, he had people in the crowd where he was begin to say things like, Obama is a Muslim, Obama's not an American, Obama is dangerous. And in both cases, he not only stopped the people, he told them what they were saying wasn't true. That Obama was a decent man and qualified to be president. Now, what we know subsequently, and we probably knew it at the time, is wedge politics works. If your goal is to get elected, wedge politics works. Play it. Play Obama as a evil person. Lock her up. Wedge politics works. John McCain chose not to use it. He made himself vulnerable in that situation to losing to stand for a principle. I think that's a small example of civic vulnerability. And again, I want to suggest that maybe we can work in education to help people think about this. We can certainly show them examples of it and think about how to work this through. I know St. Paul is often not very well accepted at universities, but I want to end with, I started with St. Paul and being asked what will this babbler say, and I want to end with him. We could argue about this for a long time. I do think he's largely misunderstood. And I think his interloping at Athens, it's described in the New Testament in Acts chapter 15, is very instructive for people in civic space. Paul, who had been raised as a Pharisee, the most orthodox of Jews, went to a pagan city. Now, among other things, Orthodox Jews didn't like statuary of idols. And if you've ever been to Athens, even today, it's loaded with them, and it was more loaded with them then, everywhere. But Paul went to Athens, and the first thing he did was he made his case publicly in the agora, in the marketplace. He put himself out there in the public space. His interaction in the public place was so intelligent and so thoughtful and so good that members of the Areopagus, the learned community, if you like, the university faculty, invited him to come a little bit up the hill, past more of those statues, to the Areopagus, which in Athens geographically is about halfway up the hill from the Agora to the Acropolis, where he made his case again. And in making his case, he demonstrated, A, that he knew with whom he was talking. He knew their culture, he knew their language, he knew their religious beliefs, he knew their general worldview. He quoted their poets. He began his conversation by affirming their faith. And in the end, he won some converts. A few. And others were intrigued and said, we'd like to hear this fellow again. And others just said, no. We're having nothing to do with this. And they walked away. I think that's what we are in public space. We don't get to have our way. We get to take our place, whether we're from a religious community or not. We don't get to dominate. We get to have our say and interact with people, I think, using civic empathy and civic vulnerability and moving forward. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Alan. We do have time probably for about 15 minutes of questions, and we can move on to the reception afterwards.
You said at the beginning that you didn't like the Steven Pinker's definition of faith being belief without evidence. What definition do you like?
Ooh, define faith. There's a question. Well, faith certainly involves a leap for which there isn't evidence, right? Certainty is the opposite of faith, right? So some people, if they say they're certain, if they are certain, they don't have faith, right? So that faith does involve, but it doesn't mean you don't think things through, that you don't consider evidence for and against the faith position that you have, and that you don't test your faith principles out in living, right? So I don't know that I can define faith. But I certainly think a lot about mine, and some people that are a lot brighter than I, in my own tradition, have written about it and thought about it and constructed evidence for it. But in the end, there are lots of things I think we attach ourselves into this world for which we can't prove in the scientific sense of the word, right? But I think one of my reasons I'm here is because I think Mark Knoll, who's an historian at Notre Dame, a church historian at Notre Dame, wrote a book that he got lambasted for, called in the 1980s, I think, called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And one of the lines in that book is, the scandal of the evangelical mind is there isn't one. And that's what I'm concerned about, the idea that people of faith don't have a mind and don't use their mind, that you have to check your mind at the door to be a person of faith. I don't believe that's never been my experience. I think it's dangerous when that happens. And we need in our religious communities to practice an education that teaches people to use their mind and question their own faith. That doubt has a huge place to play in religious education, because people have to think through. That people should come to the conclusion that they hold the faith because they've thought about it, not because somebody told them about it. I don't think that's a very satisfactory answer, but I don't have a quick definition.
Thank you, Alan, for all that you put on our plate. I think sometimes that we create problems for ourselves, not only in terms of some of our behavior, but in terms of what you're saying. Because we use expressions such as, and you use it as well, people of faith.
Yes.
And that has come to mean religious people. But you can't tell me that secular people are also not people of faith. They have beliefs, right? We even use the term believers and non-believers, but that's very unhelpful.
Yeah.
Because secular people are also believers. So that's why I've gone to use the term worldviews, and I say everybody has a worldview, right? So let's explore them, and get people who hold secular beliefs to admit that they also take a leap of faith, right? So that levels the playing field. So people like Pinker and Dawkins and so forth have as much faith as a religious person. It's just that they put their faith in other things, right? They're just as irrational, right, as anyone else, even though they claim to be rational. Because where is the evidence that the rational will get us the truth? See, that's a leap of faith. So I think that we can level the playing field by changing our terminology a little bit, and then in terms of your the title, faith in the public's faith,
Religion in
having
public.
faith in citizenship, place of religion. Why don't we talk about the place of worldviews in the public square? Because then we can argue the case that, hey, everybody has a worldview, so why is yours privileged and not somebody else's privilege?
I had a very pragmatic reason for choosing the title. I thought it would bring people out. Because we're not supposed to talk about religion or politics, and I propose a lecture in one lecture to do both. So I take your point. Yeah, I mean, especially the first one. I mean, my argument was about secularity, is it is a faith. It is a position that holds to a number of creeds. I mean, I could go on about civic religion, right? We have a hymnary of civic religion. We sing national songs. I mean, Richard John Lewis has a great quote. You know, in America, they say they have a religion, the separation of church and state, and their laws are decided by 9 people in priestly robes inside a Greek temple. Right? We just added the 9th person this week. So.
My question is, why are religious objects considered very toxic in public places?
Considered what?
Very toxic, like forbidden. That's one question. The other one is, where's the line drawn for a society that separates religion and state? So I look at Russia, or let's say former USSR, and China. Like, they actually forbade religion practices, I believe. But today we see how citizens from these countries actually embrace religion. So is it not an aberration that Western countries are actually thinking backwards when other people have tried the same exact thing and failed?
Well, first question is, why is religion so toxic in public space?
The religious objects.
Religious objects, why are they so toxic in public space? Well, I don't hold with the position, so I hesitate to argue for it. But the thing that I hear mostly is that many of the religious symbols are themselves symbols of oppression. So especially, I mean, I actually think that this is largely targeted at the way women dress. And I find it ironic that we're going to liberate women by telling them how they should dress. I mean, there's a slight irony there. But I think the rhetoric I hear in the debates in France or Quebec is that this is a symbol of oppression, and we believe in the equality of men and women. In Canada, we enshrine the equality of men and women in our Constitution, which legally applies in federal institutions. There's always some give and take with these things, right? The other reason I think there is a historic fear, religious people have earned some of the critique that they receive, right? So we've messed up. Those people who are from the traditional faith traditions have messed up. What Terry Eagleton describes as the history of warfare and oppression and things like that, some of it we got to own. And so people don't want to go back to that. People have memories of that. I grew up in Quebec. I was born in 1954. I grew up in Quebec. I lived through that almost lightning fast shift from a province dominated by the Roman Catholic Church and people dominated by adherence to that to people to the most secular province in terms of church attendance and adherence to those things in the country. And you see a lot of people saying the church oppressed me, wouldn't let me think for myself, wouldn't let me make life decisions for myself, and I don't want to go back to that. So I'm surmising that those are some of the reasons why, in that case, government. Your second question is a really interesting one for a civic educator. Where are the lines? Because I'm not arguing there are no lines. There are some religious practices that should be restricted and are restricted in Canadian law, or practices people claim are religious or religiously motivated. So there is no right that we exercise absolutely. We restrict freedom of speech in some ways. We restrict freedom of movement in other ways. We restrict religious expression in some ways. Those are things that are worked out in democratic societies in a fluid thing. We always want to kind of, part of the simplistic thinking about citizenship, the thinking I was trying to counter when I said religion shouldn't be seen as a problem, but as part of context. When it's seen as a problem, you can adopt something like the secularization thesis, fix it, and get on with it, and it's done. But it isn't going to be done. In Canada, we had a constitutional discussion in the 1980s called Meech Lake. I don't know if you were here in Canada during that thing, but a former prime minister jumped in and he said something that people who understand the context, he said something very interesting when he opposed it. He said his problem was the Meech Lake Accord was recognizing or giving into certain historic demands that the province of Quebec had. And he was worried that we were going to give in and the English people and the rest of Canada were going to say, there, settled. But when you live together, when people live together in a marriage, in a community, it's never settled. It's never set. We're evolving how it is we live together for it. It's conversation. Democratic society is an ongoing conversation. In 1999, the Parliament of Canada passed a resolution overwhelmingly affirming marriage as the union between one man and one woman. In 2005, it passed legislation allowing for same-sex marriage. That, by the way, is lightning fast shift. That most cultural shifts aren't that fast, but societies shift. And in democratic societies, we're in an ongoing conversation about how that shift takes place. Whatever you think about it. My comment here is that we're all allowed to get into it. Conservatives or liberals, people of varying worldviews, people from traditional religious backgrounds, we're all allowed to get into it. I do think there are ways in which it's better or worse to get into it, right? So that the way, what I worry about as a civic educator, the toxicity and the division that we see around the world isn't working. If we can't talk with each other across lines, we can't do politics. Politics is fundamentally discussing, thinking about, arguing about what is the common good. If we can't even agree on a language and an approach, we can't do it. I think everybody should be allowed in, but there will be lines, and I know of no important public policy issue that's been settled to everyone's satisfaction, and where the solution lasts forever. It's never done. And I think one of the greatest things that education could do, I'm working on a book called Rescuing Reason. So I like being rational, I think. I'm working on a book called Rescuing Reason, and I think in humanities education, we've given up the ghost. And in humanities, I'm a history teacher and they're English literature teachers. We teach literacy, not literature anymore. Not the same thing. And Marilyn Robinson would tell you this in spades, that the purpose of the humanities education is to help us be more human and humane and to think things through better, and to think about the complexities of life. Margaret Atwood has said they always come after the novelists because for the novelists it's never simple. And we have to, I think one of the most important things, we're in the Faculty of Education right now, for educators to do is to develop a tolerance for ambiguity. The ability to live with the fact that it's never done. That we're in a conversation that's complex and contested, and we have to continue to work it through. And as a teacher, that's what I want to help my students understand more than anything else. What literature does is give you examples of that. What history does is give you examples of that. And not only do they give you examples of that, they give you methodological approaches to think in complex ways. So don't believe any of this crap that the humanities give you great job preparation skills. That's how we've tried to sell the humanities. As they've declined, we tried to sell them that you'll be able to talk to people better. You'll be able to write your reports better. You'll be able to do all these jobs. Screw that! You'll be a better person if you study the humanities. That's the reason. All those other things are true. But the real reason for studying the humanities, for dealing with human complexity, for dealing with theology, which I would count as one of the humanities, is understanding who we are and who other people are and how it is we think across lines. It's to be more human, not to do a better job. That's the most important thing about that educators do, is help people to become more fully human, not to get them ready for work. Right? If you're not better, if we don't get better at this stuff, it doesn't matter if you can code. Somebody can tell the premier that.
So if we move to a system of worldviews, I guess my question is, on what basis will we judge which worldviews are most affirming, best, most redemptive? And careful if your answer is to appeal to reason, because then maybe you're privileging reason over faith.
Okay. I don't know. I only know we can only do it. That the only just way to try to do it together. And we will make mistakes. We haven't always chose the most affirming way, and those kinds of things. But I would say we have to make it less about winning and more about relationships. Right? What worries me about what worries me about people from my own faith tradition is we've sold it out. We've employed strategy. I see religious people, Christian people, doing three things for this: feeling pressure from being regarded as anachronistic and a problem. So the response is withdraw into little enclaves. We're going to hide out in our monastic communities. There's actually a famous book written just a year or two ago called "Return to Monasticism," advocating that Christians just withdraw and hide out. People of religion. Another response is to respond in kind, to attack, to vilify. It's horrific to follow someone, a teacher who said, love your enemies, turn the other cheek, count others better than yourself. To follow that with vilification and attack seems to me to be just. Another response is to just sell out what it is we believe and compromise and to give up on our worldview position, on our faith position. And I think when everybody thinks alike, no one thinks very much. So it doesn't do you much good if I stop thinking for myself. I don't think. So I don't think any of those solutions. So I think the solution that works is some kind of engagement in community, and we have to decide together which ones when we set up the Constitution, what we're saying is these are the most affirming things. I think we're trying to answer that question. But our Constitution has an amending formula. That means it can be changed, right? And so we need to be open and fluid to changing things, to recognizing things when harm comes up. I think the TRC has been a case of that, right? All of a sudden, you hear the stories. You look that in the face and you have to say, we've been guilty. I've been guilty. I've participated in the unjust treatment of other people. I need to find a way to do it. And I think religious communities have lots to contribute to thinking about how it is we do reconciliation. They contributed to the problem. I showed a slide that said my own church ran Indian residential schools. So we have a responsibility to do something to reconcile. but this is a relationship and it's always tough. I don't know if that answers your question, but we have to decide together.
Seems like there's an impossibility at the heart of this, but I don't know that we'll solve
Yeah,
it.
we don't have talked about this before. I'm faced with this. I have about 6 pages in the introduction to the book I told you about, and it begins with an elaborated discussion of how my world is falling apart that I began with. And I end that section with a bunch of questions. Can we do this? Can we square this circle? Can we put together systems of secularity and non-secular religion, and can we live together? And there are days, especially since the summer of 2016, I begin that. I was at a conference in Europe with people like me, civic educators from 26 countries across Europe, and we gathered together in June. And these are all people who believe in democratic engagement, in justice, in social justice, in making more just and humane societies. They're all people in this particular group who believe in the idea of Europe rather than these other small nations. And we gathered a week before the Brexit vote. And our colleagues from Britain who believe in Europe and justice and the benefits that they saw that the European Union had brought told us not to worry, that the polls showing the Remain side was going to win by just a little bit were right. So we all on the first day of the conference breathed a little easier because these experts on civic life told us it was all going to be okay. And the next day, Jo Cox, a British MP, was stabbed to death while she campaigned for the Remain side by a man shouting, "Britain first." And we went into despondency by the viciousness of that act. And then a week later, Brexit. That was followed by that French election that I read about, by the way. And so if you think Donald Trump is the problem, he isn't. We need to recover ways to live together and argue these things through together without stabbing each other on the street. We do. And so I don't know if that's possible, to be honest, but I'm an educator, and you can't teach without thinking tomorrow will be better than today. That's what teaching is about, that tomorrow will be better than today, that we can teach people these things. So I'm going to keep trying to teach people these things. That's what I do.
Spirituality is existential crisis that we're going through. For me, like spirituality, the sense that you want to try to understand the world in a compassionate way, and be open to everyone, but you know the world is falling apart. You know, and spirituality in whatever form or shape it might take, whether it's religion, or secular, or even going to your yoga class, you know, could be more mindful meditation. There's a lot of things going on to kind of say, how do I escape from a lot of the things you were talking about? Brexit, Trump.
I don't. That's not really a question there. That's more of a comment, I think. I mean, Steven Pinker says it's all getting better. So you want to get Pinker's last book because he says basically a book called Our Better Angels. It's all getting better. And I am a student of history, so I would say that it's probably been worse, right? So this isn't. There's a great book called How Democracies Die, and it's great because they describe in really analytical terms from around the world some of the processes that I've talked about tonight. But they also describe how these things have happened before, right? And more positive times came. So I think everybody likes to fall into an apocalyptic space from time to time and says it's all over. This is the worst time that ever was. I don't think it is the worst time it ever was. We're just celebrating the end of World War I. Celebrating, that's the wrong word. We're commemorating the end of World War I. That was some pretty desperate times there. That's way worse than what we're experiencing right now. So I don't want to. I'm a teacher, and so yeah. I mean, there are ways. I do recommend finding for yourselves ways to escape every once in a while the immediate sense of what's going on now, right, and getting away from it, whether it's doing yoga or retreating in a religious sense, or finding a good trashy novel and reading it. One more question, James.
Well, I'm thinking of an author, his name's David Abram, wrote a book called Spell of the Sensuous. He wrote a book called Spell of the Sensuous. And what I hear you're talking a lot about has to do with showing greater care and respect for the people that we share communities with.
Yeah.
And I'm a bit confused. I didn't grow up with religion. I didn't grow up really with much faith in my life. And I've got 3 kids, so we always talk about this stuff, and I find difficulty with the language of this, because I think in principle I have issues with a lot of the basic notions of Christianity. But getting back to what you're talking about with civil vulnerability and all that stuff, I see a lot of this apathy that I know you're trying to address, and you see how faith communities can have a place in all that. I'm wondering though, Abram talks about in his book how faith and science, and we always talk about them being antagonistic in principle, are really talking about the same things, experiences of worlds that are kind of beyond our everyday experience in life. You know, these are things that we can't touch and feel and really know. And it seems like that seems to be one of the basic problems that we have in society, is this, you know, I think in schools, I remember when there was this oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, you know, we thought we were doing our job, and we put the video of it on the smart board, and we're going to watch this, we're going to show concern and you know, and all this, and then we went along with our day after it was over, you know, through the week of showing it. So I guess I'm wondering if faith, if it's much like science is, it kind of creates this distance really with what I think what you're looking for. We all kind of experience greater distance with others rather than closeness. I'm wondering if what Abram's talking about, if in principle faith is kind of like science, it creates this abyss in a way with others in principle, because it's talking about these other worlds. How can that be reconciled with what we really need in society, which is, I think, a new kind of language of talking about closeness with others. I don't know, it's more commentary.
Well, I just say this: read the book "Becoming Human" by John Vanier, who is his thing is becoming more closely connected, and he's motivated by his faith. Although it's certainly not a preachy book, but his book is about how we include all people. Large communities are communities of people with intellectual disabilities living with people who aren't classified as having intellectual disabilities, as a way to learn to live together, not as a way for one to serve the other, right? And to affirm what is human in every person. That's where I'm coming. So I think faith sometimes does that. And sometimes it does what you said. I don't think Marx is wrong when he said it's the opiate of the masses. Sometimes it is. If you all love Les Mis, and I'll end with this, you all love Les Mis, it's a profoundly depressing story from a position of faith, right? So as they're marching off to the barricades, do you hear the people singing the songs of angry men? It's the music of a people who will not be slaves again. We're going to overthrow these aristocratic SOBs. But it ends, they lose, they're defeated. And it ends with an equally stirring song that is pretty depressing. Beyond the barricades, there is a world you want to see. In other words, heaven is where it's at. That falls right into Marx. That's what we always tell the poor. You ain't going to get it here. Don't worry about it. You're going to get it in heaven. So some manifestations of faith say that. They detach. They say, stand back. Don't engage with the world. You have to take, inshallah. What comes, comes. There are fatalistic streams of belief in all faith traditions, I think. That's not the one to which I hold. I have one that focuses on engaging with the world and other people and working to make the world a better place. Jesus said we'd always have the poor with us. I don't think he was saying that makes poverty okay. That's not how I interpret that comment. All right. Anyway, I want to thank you for indulging me in a very personal project, for letting me talk about these parts of my life that sometimes aren't talked about at the university, but I've wanted to talk about and write about for some time. So thanks for being a great audience. Thank you.
And thank you, Alan, on behalf of
225.
225, last door on the left, and we'll have a reception in there. So thanks very much.